My own sense is with regards to China-India relations, there was a certain stability to the relationship before 2020. And when Galwan happened, there was surprise on the Indian side in the sense that it was hard to understand why they would choose that particular moment, especially because it galvanized Delhi to think about their relationship with China in a significantly different way.
Right.
I think that for China, there isn't a lot of appetite for compromise, which would be necessary to find a solution to the border issue. But also, by not resolving the border issue, it allows them to put pressure on India whenever they want to.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. You are on our evening program, The Gist. I'm Nitin Gokhale. And our special guest today on The Gist is Professor Joseph Torigian, who is a professor of China and Russia studies at the American University in Washington, D.C. and is currently visiting India. So we thought it's a good occasion to ask him what does he think of the global flux that we find ourselves in, and especially in the context of what's happening in Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine, and of course, what is happening inside China, which is our focus at StratNews Global. So welcome to this program, Joseph.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So let me start with what you think of Xi Jinping's China post the 20th Party Congress in the past 3 or 4 months or 5 months now. Where is it now?
Well, at the time of the 20th Party Congress, people looked at the selection of a new group of deputies that had very close ties with Xi Jinping and nobody who had come up without having at least some contact with him. They looked at the political report and they saw a lot of language about security and ideology. And there was a conclusion that China would double down on policies that were failing, which included zero COVID, the crackdown on real estate. And what we've seen actually is more flexibility than was expected. We've seen them move a little bit away from the real estate crackdown. We saw them move very quickly, shockingly to many people, from zero COVID. And now China, I think, is trying across a whole host of different issue areas to achieve two things at once, right? So even though the Congress report talked about security, it doesn't mean that they don't care about the economy. And even though it talked about China's rise and having a new, bigger role in the international community, that doesn't mean that they're not trying to have at least some kind of a constructive relationship with some key partners. But when you pursue more than one goal at once, sometimes the two logics can conflict with one another. So for example, we've seen, the commerce minister say that foreign business people are like family and should feel completely at home in China. But we've also seen this crackdown on consultancies, on these organizations that are hired to do due diligence on companies in China, as well as this new anti-espionage law.
Right.
So I don't think that China only cares about security or only cares about development, but there's this view that if you don't have security, you can't have development. And the same competing logic we've seen, I think, in the international arena as well, where this trip by the French president to China was seen as a big victory, where he used a lot of lines that China uses to talk about how China thinks Europe should behave and strategic autonomy and that kind of thing. But then, of course, the Chinese ambassador to France made a rather unfortunate set of comments about the sovereignty of countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, which shows that there's still a very tough, prickly side to Chinese diplomats as well.
Right. Yeah, in fact, that's what the contradictory signals that you get from Chinese leadership or the Chinese establishment is something that confounds people. But since you are a China-Russia scholar, and especially because you're writing a book on Xi Jinping's father, I'm told, do you think Xi Jinping has opened too many fronts at the same time, or he is confident enough to take them all on in one go?
That's a wonderful question. So first of all, we have to emphasize that it's hard to overstate how little we actually know about how the Chinese system works. So if you look at how outside observers have fared trying to understand China at the time, and then compare it with what we know now as new historical materials become available, often we don't do so well. And that's not because outsiders are dumb. It's because even within the Chinese system, it's hard for people at the very apex of power to know exactly what the top leader is thinking, right? And one of the reasons there's been so much struggle within the Chinese Communist Party is that people very close to the top leader incorrectly intuit what it is the top leader wants. So for me to intuit what Xi Jinping wants is even more dangerous. Having said that, there is this reputation for Xi Jinping as someone who is ambitious, aggressive, and I think that there is certainly an element to that. He certainly has a sense of mission, and there are certainly a lot of different corners of the world where China has created a difficult situation for itself. But I don't want to discount the cautious side of Xi Jinping as well. And that when he tries to maximize security, when he tries to maximize control, that's not necessarily a sign of ambition, but a sign of this sense that China needs to do absolutely everything that it can to prevent instability and to prevent chaos.
Okay. So that's how the world should look at Xi Jinping, I suppose. But given the fact that he doesn't have best of relations with the United States, neither does he have the old stability with India, and the Taiwan question always has an overhang over the Chinese policy. Just to sort of look at, say, 5 years down the line, or how Xi Jinping will react to these situations is constantly speculated, at least in India and in Taiwan, and scholars in the United States do this. How do you see these three aspects of China's foreign policy playing out?
So those are three very different issue areas with three very different logics.
Right.
And especially with regards to India, I'm sure that you have a better view than me. My own sense is with regards to China-India relations, there was a certain stability to the relationship before 2020. And when Galwan happened, there was surprise on the Indian side in the sense that it was hard to understand why they would choose that particular moment, especially because it galvanized Delhi to think about their relationship with China in a significantly different way.
Right.
I think that for China, there isn't a lot of appetite for compromise, which would be necessary to find a solution to the border issue. But also, by not resolving the border issue, it allows them to put pressure on India whenever they want to. I think that they're probably cautious about pushing India too far, which is why we haven't seen more deaths on the border since 2020. But this is something that's going to hang over the heads of policymakers in India.
Sure.
With regards to Taiwan, the Russian invasion of Ukraine shows that authoritarian regimes will do what they think they can get away with. So anyone who says that we know exactly what China will do is wrong. And I think that Taiwan is certainly an emotional issue for Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
On the other hand, this idea that war is imminent may be an exaggeration because for Xi Jinping, this individual who is so totally loyal to the CCP and cares about the CCP must understand that a war is dangerous. And if he thinks that China is on the rise, which he seems to believe based on what he says, then he can afford to wait. Having said that, they also have come to the conclusion, it seems, that they think the U.S. is unilaterally changing the situation. Now, of course, that's also what the United States believes about China. But given that dynamic, the possibility for China to express its displeasure in a way that's dangerous, we've seen the military exercises that happened during Speaker Pelosi's visit, that there can be accidents, and in that kind of political atmosphere, those accidents can be dangerous.
Right. So that's a broad sweep of the situation. Why I asked you that question was, the Chinese are often heard and seen to be writing that India is getting closer to the United States, and therefore we need to teach them a lesson, or at least prevent them from going to the United States. But by doing all these aggressive actions against India, they're possibly pushing India closer to the US than ever before. So how do they sort of solve this contradiction in their approach?
Well, we see this across China's approach to the entire world, right? That you have a soft, welcoming smile, but you also have hard power. And the idea is that you create a calculus within the opposing regime that you see doing things that China doesn't like is very costly, and doing things that China likes as very beneficial. Now, of course, it's an extremely difficult balance to achieve.
Exactly.
Because when you use economic coercion, it shows that this is something China does and makes you worry that they'll do it again.
Right. Okay, so let's move on from China a little bit towards Russia. And it's more than a year and a half now that the Russian action against Ukraine has played out. China has been steadfast in its support. India has managed to try and strike a balance. Of course, there are questions over India's stand, but that's a different topic altogether. So how do you see the China-Russia relationship?
So I think that the view in Beijing is if the West is opposed to your rise, you need to have a partner in the Russian Federation who similarly sees the West as skeptical of your regime, to put it mildly.
Sure.
Right? And that China will want to have Russia's support if there is ever a crisis in a place like the Taiwan Strait. And there's a lot of economic benefits to the relationship. At the same time, I think that this is not an alliance in the sense that China is not obligated to support Russia in the way that they were supposed to support each other when they were formal allies during the Cold War. I think they've learned that lesson. And so the relationship is less close, but maybe more resilient in that particular sense. So China wants to preserve its economic and reputational, wants to protect economic and reputational concerns in the European Union. So when it talks to the Russians, it affirms the strategic partnership, but when it talks to the Europeans, it says that we don't support the war and that we're not supplying weapons. And that balancing act is something that hasn't been easy for them to do, but it's something that they're trying to do.
It's a difficult act, like you said. Let's see how it pans out and it goes forward. One final question about your project that you have undertaken. Xi Jinping's father was as influential. He was a first-generation communist leader. What is interesting in his life and career, which you can share with our Indian viewers?
Well, India plays a small but significant part in the book. For example, when Xi Jinping, the father of Xi Jinping, visited the Soviet Union in 1959, he left early. And the reason for that was the Soviets released a public statement that was seen in Beijing as too neutral about a conflict between Beijing and Delhi that happened around that time.
Oh, one of those clashes that happened.
Exactly. Yeah. So Xi Jinping left Russia early because of a view that the Russians were not supportive enough of China during one of the border clashes that happened in the summer of that particular.
And in your research, did you find him that he had some views on India?
Well, in the 1980s, Xi Jinping managed the Tibetan issue, and he warned the Tibetans not to come under the control of the Indians. He talked to the Tibetans about how India was weak and not united, as opposed to China, which was a country that had come together and was able to get things done. He said that China would be able to put pressure on India whenever they really wanted to. So this was someone who, like many as part of his generation, was skeptical of Indian intentions, but also looked down upon Indian capabilities.
So if you really look back to these 50, 60 years, nothing much has changed in the elite Chinese view of India in many ways. From what his father used to think, I think Xi Jinping also probably thinks of the same way as India, of India, I'm sure. But we'll have more occasions to discuss all that going forward. But thanks for your time and your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So that was Joseph Torigian, who is a professor, as I said, at the Washington, D.C., the American University in Washington, D.C. And you heard his views. So keep watching StratNews Global. We bring you interesting guests, knowledgeable guests every day. Do send your feedback. And of course, we'll take up topics that interest you whenever we can. For the time being, it's goodbye.